My name is Teresa Griffiths, and I was a military nurse for 27 years and 3 months in the Princess Mary's Royal Air Force Nursing Service. But before that, I was an NHS nurse, and I did my training at St Bartholomew's Hospitals here in London back in the 1980s. And subsequently acted as a staff nurse at St Bartholomew's Hospital before specialising in neurosurgery at Queen Square, and then being a sister at the Oxford Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford. And in the early 90s I decided that I needed and wanted to be a military nurse, so joined the Royal Air Force. I'm rubbish with water, so the Navy was never going to be an option. And I really was fascinated with aeromedical evacuation, so looking after patients in flight. So that really made me really interested in the Royal Air Force. The other thing that I was really interested in joining as being a military nurse at that time was going into the pre-hospital care arena, because back in the early 90s, nurses were predominantly in the hospitals and very few nurses actually worked outside the hospital sort of walls. And I was very keen to get into pre-hospital care trauma and actually work outside. And I felt that by being a military nurse would give me that conduit and ability to be able to do that. So I commissioned into the Royal Air Force at RAF Cranwell as a flying officer, and it was interesting training. I really enjoyed the academic side. I didn't find the physical side so easy because I'm more of an academic person, but it was a real challenge, and it was a really excellent introduction into the military, and particularly ignited my interest into leadership and what my leadership journey might be in the future. So I thought it was going to be much tougher, but actually when I trained at St Bartholomew's in the 1980s, it was actually very strict. So on my very first day of being a Barts nurse and getting our uniforms, we had to kneel on the floor and our hems had to touch the floor, and our nails got inspected. So my nails today can never be longer, and our hair had to be short underneath our cap. And there was even a way of actually sitting, Bart's way, which is actually what I'm sitting today. Bart's nurses had to sit a certain way. So actually joining the military wasn't actually as tough as my first day back in the NHS in the 90s and 1980s. But yes, it had similarities in the discipline and the uniform and being having an immaculate uniform, etc., which I really enjoyed. So as a military nurse, you have various military competencies that you have to achieve. And one of those is being clinically fit to deliver the role that you need to do. So I did a lot of training in sort of pre-hospital care trauma, because that was going to be one of my roles. And as an RAF nurse, I specialised in about 5 years of being in the Air Force, of being a specialist aeromedical evacuation nurse. And that was a very intense training. It was 4 or 5 weeks of academic training, and then actually going on aircraft all over the world and actually practicing and rehearsing and becoming competent as an aeromedical evacuation nurse, because lots of things happen at altitude that people don't think, and it can be quite dangerous. So that was really interesting, and that really laid the foundations for my future career when I started deploying, because I undertook the role of being an aeromedical evacuation liaison officer. So I would be the nurse on the ground that facilitated that coordination of those patients back from the deployed space back to the UK. So you had to make sure that those patients were fit to fly before they actually got onto the aircraft. So that training was all part of making sure that you could actually deliver that. Yeah, so as an aeromedical nurse, your plane is the ward in the sky. So it's just like any other environment. And just we're sitting here, in Florence Nightingale's, museum, and Florence Nightingale says that the hospital shall do the sick no harm. Well, as a military nurse, it doesn't matter where you deploy, where you nurse a patient. You don't, that's not an excuse to give substandard care. You have to give the highest level of care you can. And it was really interesting, because sometimes, even though it was really dark and noisy and smelly and cramped, you could actually improve the patient's care by bringing them back. So actually, it doesn't matter where you actually nurse. It's always striving to deliver the highest level of care. But most of my personal experience was actually based in the country, the deployed country, in facilitating and bring it, facilitating to make sure that those patients could come back. And then there would be a specialist team that would come out, collect those patients and then bring them back. I consider myself very, very lucky as a military nurse because it depends on what time you were a military nurse in history. And I happened to join when there were lots of lots of things happening in the world. My first deployment was to Kosovo in 2000, which was a real experience because you get taught to know how to deal with things. You get taught to be, what you need to do clinically, but actually deploying into a country that was sort of minus 20 at the time with lots and lots and lots of snow. And I remember getting on an aircraft and being the only female on the aircraft, with very few officers, and with lots and lots and lots of soldiers who clearly knew what they were doing, and I had no idea what I was doing. But being an officer, you had to have that portrayal of, I know what I'm doing, I know where I'm going. And you actually arrived at 1 o'clock in the middle of the night, in the dark, not even knowing who was going to pick you up or if someone was going to come and collect you. Because being in the RAF, we often went as singleton augmentees rather than a big regiment. So if you're in the army, you go as a big regiment, as a big group. But we often augmented the other services in support of the roles that we did. So that was a real sort of eye-opener. But Kosovo, I was there for 6 months. It was a real experience. A lot of Groundhog Day in Kosovo. And I think that's, people will talk about deployments and a lot of excitement, but a lot of deployments are Groundhog Day, and every day feels like a week, and every week feels like a month, and every month feels like a year. So when you're there for 6 to 9 months, that can be a really, really, really long time. And I thought, because there wasn't very much going on in the world at the time, I actually extended my tour in Kosovo, not realising that I was then going to deploy another 4 or 5 times after that in quite quick succession. So I came back and worked in my military role in the UK, but then shortly after got deployed to Sierra Leone, where again I was deployed as the Aeromed Liaison Officer, so making sure that any patients that needed to come back to the UK were fit, ready to do that. But the difficulty with Sierra Leone was that it was we only had a flight once a week, so you couldn't just put somebody on the next day. You had to care for that patient. And in Sierra Leone, we were dependent on a UN hospital, so you had to really learn to collaborate and work together to deliver that high level of care. And also when you deploy, you get to do other roles that you might not have perhaps chosen to do. So in Sierra Leone, I was also the officer commanding of the primary healthcare and the blue light. So we had a helicopter that provided support to those areas that were sort of further out of reach. So you provided the medics to support all of that. So it really stretched your knowledge and your ability and your confidence, and you really had to learn to adapt. And of course, Africa was completely different from sort of being very cold and snowy and in Kosovo when I arrived. After that, I came back again, and then I deployed to Karachi, which was supposed to be quite a short deployment, and it was very different in that we were based at Karachi Airport, and we were my role there was with another doctor and a couple of medics looking after the air crew of the Hercules aircraft, and their role was to fly into Afghanistan each night to provide, to take cargo and stuff to Kabul, and our role was to look after the air crew. But there was a number of different air crew and aircraft from other countries, so we were responsible for that. And that was probably one of my most dangerous tours, because at the time Karachi was a very dangerous place, and there were lots of kidnappings, there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of bombings. So actually just going into the centre of Karachi was very dangerous. And as the nurse, I had an American ambulance, and my role was to transfer our patients if needed. But one of the things I had to do first of all, if I ever admitted a patient into the hospital, was actually make sure it was safe, because one of the greatest risks was actually somebody might actually take that patient out. So they had to have a 24-hour guard the whole time. So we had to really think, does this patient need to be in that hospital, or actually can I look after them in the space that we were at the airport, and get them back to the UK. So that was a real challenge, and yes, it was quite dangerous at the time. In 2003, I deployed to Iraq for the war, which is obviously the 20th anniversary this year. And I was very privileged to be part of the Aeromed holding facility. And interestingly, we were based between two runways at Kuwait International Airport. So it was incredibly loud, because all the normal aircraft were coming in and out, but of course also all of the military aircraft were coming in, huge aircraft. 47,000 British troops went, and of course there were thousands and thousands of other, troops from other countries. But my role there with my team was that we were like the end sieve of all of the medical capabilities in theatre. So the one thing that is really important is when you deploy, and especially when you are, at war or in a conflict, is that you have spare beds in a hospital, so that if patients, if the soldiers get injured, there is a space for them to be treated. So if your hospital is full, you cannot actually continue with that war fighting. It has to stop. So there always has to be a flow out. So our Aeromed holding facility was responsible for all the patients coming from all the different hospitals, and there were multiple hospitals deployed, and Argus, which was the naval hospital ship, and also other areas. And we had 2 dedicated VC-10 aircraft, which was the first time in a very long time in history that was dedicated to actually transferring patients back to Cyprus, where they were cared for in the hospital there, or they were transferred back to the UK if they weren't, if they needed more care than what the hospital at Cyprus could provide. But the unique factor was there that we had very basic conditions. So we were a couple of tents between 2 runways, no paper. We used to get a phone call of up to 100 patients that were going to be on this aircraft. They would come between a particular window of time, and our role was to make sure that they were clinically fit, but we didn't have the resource or the capability to actually treat those patients. So if a patient deteriorated, we would have to, send them back to, one of their referring field hospitals, which was really close to the front line, so you really wouldn't want to do that. So our role was to literally look after those patients for a very short time of period, make sure they were fit, do all the admin, get them clinically ready to get onto that aircraft. And we had a number of teams aligned to us in the squadron that would then fly those patients to Cyprus, and then they would come back, and then they would fly them back. And we did that every 12 hours. And certainly for me, one of the lessons learned was I was part of the ground handling team rather than the flying team. And they all turned up with huge great bags, they're all their Bergens. So can you imagine 100 patients or 100 soldiers with 100 Bergens? And you had to make sure that how would you label them? We didn't have any paper, and we didn't have anything to sort of identify those luggage, but they all had to sort of go on. So one of the things that we did prior to actually the war starting was to rehearse how we were going to do it. And we did it with mind tape, different colours mind tape. And we had different areas of sort of high priority patients, low dependency patients. But also we had the whole of this luggage problem sorted as well, of how we could identify that. And I managed to borrow 50 Marines, US Marines, and we trialled it till we got really slick so that we could do it with our eyes shut. Because, of course, once the war started, there was a lot of scuds that incoming, and you were in your NBC suits, with your mask and everything else. So there was much more complexity on top of just that original thing. And one of the things that I identified as the senior nurse in the ground handling area was that my nurses were very focused on looking after those that were the most sick. So there was a risk of patients getting onto the aircraft that actually, because they weren't as injured, were missing out. So one of the things that I did was to create like a bronze, silver and gold, and actually gave my nurses permission to give various levels of care based on what the priority was at that time, because it was really essential that every patient had the ability to have a hot drink or have some hot food, or to make sure that they weren't in pain. You know, we didn't have the capacity to do great big wound dressing and changing because it wasn't safe enough. But also it was really important to make sure that, you know, that they could speak to the padre, because we had a padre, and actually, you know, they were, you know, to speak to them if they needed to. But those basic needs that we all take for granted, I needed to make sure as a senior nurse that when they got on that aircraft, everybody had had them. And sometimes you have to give your nurses permission. It's okay, you know, not to have to, you know, it's not, you know, we aren't able to give that gold standard today. And as our numbers of casualties got less, we were able to give that higher level of care. Yeah, it was really essential that everybody had those basics, you know, and those were the things that I really learned that was different from working back, you know, in the NHS, because I didn't have to make those choices there, but you had to make those difficult choices. And also I needed, you know, because it was a time of war when everybody's safety was at risk. So my leadership style had to be very different to what it normally was. And, you know, I had to have, you know, my nurses were nurses, but they had to be sergeants, they had to be officers, they had to be junior NCOs first. You know, they had to play their role, because that's what they were delivering. And I needed that leadership because of, you know, the context that we were actually managing. And if our sieve right at the very end broke, that would mean that none of those casualties could flow out of theatre, and our battle, you know, the combat warfare that was going on would have to stop. That fighting would have to stop. So it was absolutely critical that we got those patients out every sort of 12 hours. So lots and lots and lots of learning in very basic conditions, but no paper. So how do you actually record, you know, who's coming in and who's going to go into which area? So lots of flexibility and adaptability. But yes, it was a, you know, fantastic team that I worked with, and I really learnt lots from that. And then after that, I went to be what we call the officer commanding of the RAF's High Readiness Squadron. So I was the first nurse to do that in the RAF. And initially we were on 6 hours notice to move, to deploy anywhere across the world. So there was a squadron of 30 staff, doctors, nurses and medics. And we identified which was the best group or professionals that needed to go to that group to support whatever mission it was. So for me, that was more of a leadership role, making sure that my team, my squadron were fit, physically fit, clinically fit, professionally fit to deliver that role at 6 hours notice to move. So living on 6 hours notice to move for a while is actually quite a challenge. So we did manage to get it put down to 24 hours notice to move, but that's still quite quick. So you can't just vanish away for the weekend, because, you know, this is a capability that, you know, defence is relying on. And part of that, at the very end of my tour there, I was very privileged to go to Baghdad. So that was one of my sort of final deployments, where I again was the Aeromedical Evacuation Liaison Officer nurse, the ALO, and also responsible for the primary healthcare of about 300 soldiers in the Green Zone. And again, that was an incredible privilege and incredibly dangerous. It was one of the most dangerous places in the world to be at that time. But the privilege of being able to look after those 300 soldiers, and again, sitting here in the museum today, it sort of takes you back to where Florence was, and you want to make a difference to those people, you know, those soldiers, because they're a long way from home. And I was just known as the nurse, but the was as important as the nurse. And when they used to have to go out on a regular basis, en route Irish to go out, and their role was very, very difficult and hard, and the dangers were there the whole time. But it was interesting that they came to seek the nurse out, to seek myself out to speak to, and also I made sure that I was available to them. So when they were on, you know, the Green Zone was literally sort of 3 miles by 3 miles, so it's very, very small. So you couldn't travel out. But I made sure I was available to them, so I would often go up and sit with them on patrol and just ask them how they were. And in the end, I knew all of them. I knew whether they were happy, whether they were sad, so that I could actually make sure that, you know, they had what they needed, because there was such, you know, people are such a finite resource, and part of military medicine is to make sure that that resource is as fit as it can be. So there's that moral role of being a nurse in making sure that that patient feels cared for. but also it's making sure that that patient, that soldier, sailor or airman, wherever you are, is actually fit enough to do the job that they've got. So in Baghdad, we could not afford to have anybody, dropping down sick or, injured. And the biggest problem in places like Baghdad was things like diarrhea and vomiting, because it would just go through. So it was like educating your soldiers, but being there for them and for them to trust you, to come to you when they were, beginning to feel ill, rather than waiting to be, really sick and then having to do stuff that really you didn't, want to do, and potentially sending them home. So for me, Baghdad was really, really special. It was a real privilege to look after them. But also I learnt in Baghdad that I was more than a nurse, more than a military nurse, and I'd actually become a leader. And on a particular day when there was a huge explosion and we were all together in the guard room, they all looked at me, and I thought the building was going to collapse, and we all thought we were going to die, but the building remained static. And when they all looked at me and said, "We're so glad that you're here, Mum." And I was really struggling inside, because I'm thinking, I'm just a nurse. Why are they glad that I'm here? And that was the day that I realised that, I was more than a nurse, more than a military nurse, and that actually I was a leader. And that's when I really started to enjoy my leadership roles sort of going forward. It's flexibility, it's confidence. And the difference between NHS and military is that you're looking after more than a patient. You're looking after the patient, and behind every patient there is their family, and behind that family there's the regimental family. So you're not just looking after a single patient, you're looking after that entire family. So you have to remember that, and if you don't, you really get into big problems. When we were in Birmingham, and I was the military chief nurse in Birmingham, it was absolutely essential to make sure all of those aspects were looked after. But the attributes, it's everyone's got everyone's back in the military, and you're looking after almost like your own family as well. So it's slightly different when you're on perhaps on an NHS ward. So it's more meaningful, not more meaningful, but it's that camaraderie. Being a military nurse, it's about understanding the context of where those military patients have come from. So those soldiers, sailors, airmen, so that you can make sure that you give them the best care that you can. So an example is in Birmingham, a lot of the soldiers came back as sailors and Marines came back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and it only take 8 hours to get from like being on the dusty fronts, and then they would come back into this white clinical space with no boundaries. And it was really essential for there to be a military presence, and for our military nurses working alongside the NHS nurses to be able to put some boundaries on. I was in the Air Force for 27 years. I left in 2021 as a group captain, so I joined as a flying officer and left as a group captain, which I never ever dreamt that I would get to that rank. And I did break a lot of glass ceilings, not intentionally, but it really made me maybe the person that I am, and I think the RAF really helped me become the best version of myself that I could be, and gave me a confidence that I certainly didn't have before I joined the Air Force. And a lot of people say that when they saw me back in the 1980s, or when we had a reunion, that I was very quiet and they couldn't recognise me. And I think that's one of the things that being a military nurse gives you. It gives you that confidence, because every 2 to 3 years you change jobs. So you become a master of a little bit of everything, but not an expert in anything. But actually what I learnt was that actually that leadership was my golden thread throughout. My greatest leadership challenges were in Birmingham when I was the military chief nurse. I had 300 military nurses that I was responsible for, and looking after, making sure that they were okay, but also working with the NHS to provide that care for the unprecedented numbers of casualties that were coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And if you look at there's a lot of similarities to the pressures that we were under compared to recent COVID, in that the injuries were so significant and so huge that it was just unprecedented. And the nurses, both the military and the NHS, it was just continuous. It was just continuous. So even when they went home, they couldn't talk about the things that they'd seen, and they still had to have time to, do their washing and feed the families and everything else. So very similar to COVID. And a lot of my nurses, when I first got to Birmingham, actually asked if they could go to Afghanistan because it was a holiday. Because in Afghanistan, they felt they could just have one job, rather than be in Birmingham for like 3 to 4 years, where there's consistent, continuous flow of patients. But it was a real honour to look after these patients in Birmingham. And one of the things from a leadership perspective I really realised as a nurse was to be a visible role model, a bit like Florence Nightingale, in that it was really important for me to make sure that my nurses recognised that I was a visible role model. And the way I did that was that I changed my name, my title. So my name was Officer Commanding Nursing, but I realised that nobody understood what that was, and especially the soldiers, and especially a lot of the senior officers that were visiting on a regular basis. So I changed myself to the military matron, which was quite tricky in the military, in the civilian and the NHS, because matron was a more junior role than I was. But it was brilliant because the NHS recognised me as the military chief nurse, so we got over that. But being the military matron, everybody knew who I was. And I was able to go back to some of the things that I'd learnt when I was at St Bartholomew's, and I trained. So I was able to do ward rounds. So every week I had a ward round with my nurses. And what we would do is I would make sure that everybody shaved every day, everybody had a haircut when they could, that they didn't wear orange pyjamas because, boys don't wear orange pyjamas. They wore regimental uniforms. They had a tidy bed space, and they had to eat fruit. And I would go round and I would ask them, why have you not shaved? And they'd go, you don't have to make me shave, you can't make me shave. And I'm like, yes, no, you're absolutely right, I can't make you shave. So actually, you don't want to go to you don't want a McDonald's tomorrow evening. And then they would say, oh, actually, Mum, I'd love a McDonald's tomorrow, so I'll shave for you. And afterwards, they explained to me that sometimes they were there for 3 to 4 months, and although they really felt that they might have resented me asking them to shave, it was going back to those boundaries, making them feel that they're still in the military and that there was still a requirement for them to have that discipline. And the second thing I did on the second day was I took off my military day uniform and I went back into my nursing uniform that I hadn't worn for a very long time. So it was quite unusual as a wing commander to wear my nursing uniform, and I stayed in it for 4 years. Because it was a clinical passport, so I could go anywhere. And I also often wanted to sort of eyeball my patients to make sure that they were okay. So, on a Friday evening before I went home, I didn't want to get home and then, make sure, find out that patients or staff needed me. So I used to go around on my own and just eyeball all the patients. And if we had somebody or there was a family member that needed us, then I wouldn't go home. But having that clinical uniform was a passport. But also to my nurses, it said to them, I'm the same as you. I am a nurse, but more importantly, I am really proud to wear a uniform. So I wore my uniform, and that was really important. And then my final bit about leadership was my penultimate job. I was selected to be the commanding officer, which is like a chief executive officer of the Defence Medical Rehabilitation Centre at Headley Court, which is the rehabilitation centre for all of these, all our defence patients. And it was almost like the other side of being in Birmingham, which had been very acute trauma. So this was the rehabilitation side. And again, at that rank, I was the first nurse that had previously always been doctors. But I was there for my leadership, not for being a specialist in rehabilitation. But my other task was to actually relocate Headley Court to its new home in Stanford Hall. So it was the biggest transformational change programme in defence at the time, because the late Duke of Westminster had identified it as a personal project and donated millions of pounds to it. And it was a £300 million change programme. And moving people who had been there for 70 years, the Headley Court had been there for 70 years with a world reputation, to another location was a massive challenge, as well as delivering high quality, safe care to our residents who were there. So for me, it was like the end of my leadership journey in the RAF, actually doing something that if you'd asked me 23 years ago, I'd never ever have dreamed to do it. But the military had given me through my deployments, through my different roles, through my other experiences. I also worked at the Permanent Joint Headquarters, where I did a lot of the medical planning for Iraq, Afghanistan and other operations. So all of that gave me that confidence to actually then, almost that penultimate job. And it was just an amazing experience. And lots of people said it was a mission impossible, it wouldn't happen, but I knew that it would. And we did things very differently, and we got there, and we did move, and now it's a wonderful success. And we built on the foundations of Headley Court to create a new centre. Florence and Mary Seacole have a huge impact, I think, on all military nurses, and I don't think you often realise it until you actually look at it. But for me, both of them, when I was thinking about, coming here today, is what was so special about them to any other nurses. And for me, it was their commitment and their dedication, and more importantly, their courage. So their moral courage in actually standing up to societal barriers at the time, and actually stating based on evidence, because both of them were very, very intelligent women. So they used, statistics. They used, they used evidence to demonstrate their point, but to actually fight for what they felt was right to improve, the quality of care for those soldiers. And then there was their physical courage in actually, being actually in an area that was so dangerous, and also actually going into the battlefield, and actually looking after those patients. So, and actually their selflessness in putting everybody else before themselves was absolutely huge. But I think it's that real. I know we often use the word pioneers, but they were true pioneers in actually, creating that role of a nurse, because it's actually only nurses that get people better. Without nursing, people would not get better. And I think it was them that actually recognised that providing, safe, clean environment, making sure that, just through the basics, that, that is how patients get better, but also that empathy and that compassion that they were able to demonstrate to those soldiers who were a long way from home, who were in pain, who were scared. And when I was in Baghdad, and when I was on some of my deployments when you're thousands of miles away, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to join the military, so that I could be part of that and hopefully help my patients, in a similar way, and actually be a presence that would give them some sort of comfort. And I think they gave a hope to the future, didn't they? They provided that hope. You talk about Florence and the lamp, but the lamp to me is about the hope, and provide, and that message, and being visible. So I've talked about in the wards in Birmingham of being a visible role model. And I think that's what Florence did at night, making sure that she was visible to the patients, so that they were there. She was, they knew that she was there. They needed them, but also to the other nurses to be that light, to be that hope. So having left the RAF in 2021, it's quite a difficult time when you leave and when you transition. But I was very, very fortunate, and I managed to very successfully work for a wonderful company called the Drive Project, and I was their managing director for 2 years. I've recently stood down, but I still act as a consultant. And their ethos is amazing, because what they do is they use storytelling and the arts to promote physical health, mental health, and resilience and physical recovery, which was great, because it was almost like coming full circle, had what I'd done in my jobs. So we were actually looking after and capturing the stories. One of the programs was a storytelling program for Blesma, and actually seeing these soldiers that I'd actually cared for 10 years ago, who were so injured, and everybody thought, oh my gosh, they've got no future, and actually hearing what they'd done in those 10 years, and really, really, for me, demonstrated that what we did back in 2010 was correct. And latterly, I've got a portfolio of different roles, but I'm also a non-executive director for our local trust. But the other job that I do is I'm chair of a wonderful charity called Nurse Lifeline, that promotes the resilience of all nursing community, from nurses, midwives, right the way through to the social care sector, so all care workers. And we have a line that is open Monday to Friday, and we're a listening service. We're there for nurses to offload and to hopefully be a tool in their wellbeing toolbox, so that they can actually offload that. And the idea is that we change the culture of nursing because we're rubbish at asking for help. So we actually, we talk about what the issue is, and then we get on with our lives rather than it becoming more and more overwhelming and then, becoming sick and having to go off work. So the idea is that we work together with lots of organisations to try and increase the resilience of nursing. So that's really exciting.